Hey everyone, have you ever wondered just how far philosophy can push the limits of what we believe? In Nietzsche's The Antichrist, we're given a glimpse into some of his most radical and challenging ideas that flip everything we thought we knew on its head. But here's the twist. Just months after writing this, Nietzsche's mind started to unravel. Let's dive into what makes this work so powerful and how it marks a turning point in Nietzsche's own personal journey. Ready to jump in? Alright, hang on tight because this one's a bit wild. Here's a classic Nietzsche moment for you. Priests are not to be reasoned with, they are to be locked up. Yep, you read that right. This isn't some scene from a gritty thriller. This is Nietzsche in 1888, unleashing some seriously bold stuff. Little did he know, just a few months later, he'd experience a mental breakdown that would completely change the course of his life. Intense, right? So here's the kicker. This quote comes from The Antichrist, Nietzsche's final philosophical work, and it's not just some off-the-cuff remark. Oh no, this final chapter is packed with radical ideas, 6 of them to be exact, and trust me, each one is more out there than the last. It's almost like Nietzsche was saying, let's see how far I can push this, right? And maybe, just maybe, these extreme ideas are why the chapter was hidden away for decades. It was even censored for years. Yeah, censored. Like some secret, forbidden manuscript. Talk about being ahead of your time. But here's the big question. Were these radical proposals just the product of a man losing his grip on reality? Or were they just the natural consequences of his philosophy, pushed to the extreme? I mean, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one we're going to dive into. So, let's take a look at this secret last chapter of The Antichrist. It's a piece of writing so hot, it's been kept under wraps for years, and even today it's still censored in some editions. Wild, right? Back in 1889 though, things weren't as easy as just picking up Nietzsche's later works. If you were around back then, you wouldn't have been hearing about his final philosophical masterpiece. No way. You would have heard about a German philosopher who was in a mental hospital, dealing with whatever mystery illness he had. Was it syphilis? Was it that weird moment with the horse in Turin? People were definitely talking, but no one was talking about the Antichrist yet. So here's the deal. Nietzsche wrote The Antichrist in 1888, just before everything started to fall apart for him mentally. It's almost like he was on this crazy, alright, buckle up, this is about to get intense. So here's the deal. The law against Christianity, that hidden section of Nietzsche's The Antichrist, is actually super short. Like, just a page long. But don't be fooled by its size because it packs a punch. This little appendix, which Nietzsche meant to be part of the book, lays out 7 propositions that are radical. I mean, we're talking next level radical. Let's break them down. Priests? Yeah, they should be locked up. Church services? They're an attack on public morality. The place where Christianity started? It should be razed to the ground. Chastity? Totally anti-nature. Hanging out with priests? Nah, that should be a crime. Words like God, Savior, and Redeemer, they should be used as insults, criminal-level insults. And the rest? Yeah, it all follows from that. Now, this is where things get interesting. The language Nietzsche uses here is nothing like what we saw in his earlier works. This stuff is so radical, it's almost shocking, especially considering it was written in the 19th century. Remember, this was a time when pretty much anything against religion was seen as extreme. And Nietzsche wasn't just dipping his toes into controversy, he was diving in head first. But here's the kicker. Just a year before Nietzsche suffered his infamous mental breakdown in 1889, he was crazy productive. He cranked out books like The Case of Wagner, Twilight of the Idols, Ecce Homo, and of course The Antichrist, all in quick succession. And because Ecce Homo is basically his intellectual autobiography, we can see that The Antichrist stands as his last pure philosophical work. This final section, this law against Christianity, was meant to be an appendix to that work. So, these 7 propositions, yeah, they're Nietzsche's last purely philosophical thoughts. And here's something else that makes this so wild. Nietzsche actually wrote this on September 30th, 1888, which he called the first day of the year 1. Why? Because according to him, the Christian calendar was a miscalculation of time. Yep, he was that passionate about it. Now, fast forward just a couple of months later, and Nietzsche starts sending out his famous madness letters, signing them as Dionysus or the Crucified. His friends were not having it. They knew something was off and started looking for professional help. So, when you think about it, it's no surprise his friends decided to delay the publication of the Antichrist. They were like, yeah, we're definitely not putting this out there just yet. They assumed these ideas were the work of a mind already unraveling, and who could blame them? Radical, sure. Mad, maybe. But here's the question, was Nietzsche really losing it when he wrote the Antichrist? Or was this just him pushing his philosophy to its extreme limits? Yeah, the tone is hyperbolic, the generalizations are sweeping, and the language is, well, intense. But hyperbole doesn't automatically equal madness. So what's the deal? Are these final writings the result of a mind on the brink of insanity? Or are they just radical ideas that were too much for people to handle at the time? It's a tough one to call, and honestly, it's a question that's still up for debate, right? You're absolutely right to point out that the Antichrist is radical, but its arguments are anything but chaotic or erratic. In fact, the book stands out for its clarity and structured approach. Unlike many of Nietzsche's works, which are filled with aphorisms, sudden subject shifts, and poetic flourishes, the Antichrist is organized and systematic. It's a sharp critique of Christianity, but the ideas are presented logically and coherently, making it, arguably, one of his most straightforward works after Genealogy of Morals. This doesn't seem to reflect the work of a man on the verge of insanity. It's more like a carefully crafted philosophical challenge. Now let's break down the laws proposed in the book. These laws, while radical in tone, actually align quite well with the arguments Nietzsche makes earlier in the book. Nietzsche isn't just spouting off extreme ideas for the sake of shock value. These propositions build on the critiques he has already laid out. The first one in particular starts with a bold but logically consistent assertion. Every type of anti-nature is a vice. The priest is the most vicious type of person. He teaches anti-nature. Priests are not to be reasoned with. They are to be locked up. This is a heavy blow against the priestly class, but it's not out of the blue. Nietzsche had been critiquing priests for years, especially in works like Genealogy of Morals. His main beef with them is that they promote anti-nature values, values that reject the material world in favor of some idealized spiritual afterlife. Priests preach that the material world is corrupt, distracting, and evil, and that true virtue lies in turning away from it. In Nietzsche's eyes, this is a rejection of life itself. He argues that the priestly class, unable to engage with the material world in a healthy, life-affirming way, unable to achieve wealth, power, or sensual pleasures, decrees that no one should pursue these things. This, in his view, is a form of moral revenge, where the weak impose their values on the strong, turning natural human desires into vices. For Nietzsche, the aesthetic ideal that priests champion, poverty, humility, and chastity, flies in the face of life's natural instincts. These values are counter to the things that allow people to engage with the world around them: wealth, pride, and sensuality. But Nietzsche sees this as a warped moral stance, coming from a position of weakness. He compares it to the fox in Aesop's fable, who couldn't reach the grapes and then declared them to be sour. In a similar way, priests, unable to live in a way that celebrates the material world, declare it to be evil. So, is it really madness for Nietzsche to call for priests to be locked up, given all the arguments he's made about the life-denying nature of their teachings? In the context of his overall critique, it's consistent, even if extreme. But perhaps this sharp, hyperbolic language is simply a stylistic choice, an attempt to drive home the severity of what he perceives as a moral catastrophe. It's a radical proposal, but as with much of Nietzsche's work, it's designed to challenge conventional thinking and shake the foundations of society's most entrenched values. The radicalism comes from Nietzsche's belief that the priestly class has created a moral system that not only stifles life, but actually seeks to undermine it. Whether or not this justifies his extreme proposal is up for debate, but the logic behind it is clear and consistent with his earlier writings. The critique of the priestly class and their role in shaping a worldview that denies life's natural instincts forms a key thread in Nietzsche's philosophy, and as you point out, his condemnation of dialectics and reason as tools of the weak is consistent with his earlier works. Nietzsche's rejection of reason as a force of power, instead positioning it as the final defense of the powerless, finds its sharpest expression in his critique of Socrates in Twilight of the Idols. In Nietzsche's view, Socrates represents the ultimate debater, using dialectics to avoid engaging with the real, embodied aspects of life. This resonates with his broader disdain for what he sees as life-denying intellectualism, particularly in the context of religious philosophy. When Nietzsche proposes that priests should be locked up and not engaged with through reason, he's not simply advocating for censorship. It's more about the power dynamics at play. For Nietzsche, priests and their philosophy represent a weakness that corrupts society, and engaging with them rationally would only perpetuate the cycle of moral submission. The priest's worldview, one of renunciation, submission, and denial of life's pleasures, needs to be confronted directly, not with dialectics, but with a refusal to participate in its logic. In this sense, the hyperbolic call for priests to be locked up isn't so much a literal call to action as it is a symbolic one, reflecting Nietzsche's frustration with a society that allows such values to dominate. Nietzsche's radicalism on this issue extends further with his second proposed law. Any participation in church services is an attack on public morality. This proposition builds on his earlier critiques of Christianity, in which he argues that the church's teachings systematically undermine life's vitality. For Nietzsche, church services reinforce a worldview that glorifies suffering, guilt, and the denial of the material world, values that he sees as directly harmful to human flourishing. Participating in these rituals for Nietzsche is an endorsement of this life-denying framework, and thus an assault on the vitality and morality of the community. In this context, Nietzsche's critique of Protestants and Catholics becomes more nuanced. He's not condemning Christianity in a blanket sense, but rather critiquing the various forms it has taken over time. His view on Catholicism, as you rightly point out, is more complex than simply viewing it as a purely life-denying force. Historically, Catholicism has had a more flexible relationship with the material world, particularly during the Renaissance, when it often embraced sensuality and earthly pleasures. Nietzsche admired this period for its vibrancy and its embrace of life, even though it was still under the guise of Christian doctrine. Figures like Cesare Borgia, who epitomized a kind of unapologetic vitality, represented to Nietzsche the possibility of revitalizing the church, not by abandoning Christianity, but by returning to a more life-affirming, indulgent approach to existence. The notion that Protestantism, particularly in its more puritanical forms, is even more damaging to public morality, fits with Nietzsche's broader critique of asceticism and the denial of life. Protestantism, with its strict moralism and emphasis on personal sacrifice, represents a more rigid form of Christianity that Nietzsche sees as even more suffocating to human vitality than Catholicism. The further one moves from the indulgent sensual Christianity of the Renaissance popes, Nietzsche seems to argue, the more criminal and damaging the faith becomes, especially as it intersects with rationalism and the scientific worldview, which he views as equally life-denying. In the case of the philosopher being the ultimate criminal, Nietzsche is highlighting the tension between the philosopher's pursuit of truth and the world that seeks to suppress this truth in favor of conventional moral systems. Philosophers, in Nietzsche's view, are not only critics of religion, but also of the very fabric of society's accepted truths. The philosopher who engages with science and reason, and who challenges traditional religious values, becomes a criminal in the eyes of the established moral order. This is a direct continuation of Nietzsche's broader philosophical project, which aims to unmask the moral structures that have historically suppressed individual flourishing and vitality. So, while the laws Nietzsche proposes are certainly radical and hyperbolic in tone, they are consistent with his earlier philosophical work. They are not the musings of a mind slipping into madness, but rather the culmination of a radical critique of religion and morality that had been building throughout Nietzsche's career. Whether one agrees with Nietzsche's conclusions or not, these proposals are a logical extension of his philosophy, even if their extremism makes them difficult to digest. Nietzsche's critique of Protestantism, particularly in contrast to Catholicism, is deeply rooted in his broader critique of the ascetic ideal and its psychological consequences. Catholicism, despite its flaws, allowed for certain leniencies and a more pragmatic approach to human sinfulness. In this context, the sacrament of confession, the indulgent system, and the general forgiveness embedded in Catholic practices alleviated the crushing psychological burden of guilt. Nietzsche found these aspects less damaging to the individual psyche compared to the rigid, guilt-inducing doctrines of Protestantism, especially Calvinism, which imposed predestination and presented redemption as an unattainable ideal. Protestantism, for Nietzsche, epitomized the ascetic ideal by intensifying the sense of human depravity and the unattainability of salvation. This created a deeply internalized sense of guilt, fear, and a twisted view of suffering, leading to what Nietzsche called the evil conscience. This internalized guilt was a significant source of psychological anguish, as individuals were encouraged to see themselves as inherently sinful and in need of redemption, which was often framed as an impossible task. The obsessive self-loathing and continual self-torture that followed were psychological scars that, in Nietzsche's view, could only be alleviated by rejecting the moral system that created them. In contrast, Nietzsche saw Catholicism, despite its deeply flawed spiritual system, as less psychologically harmful. It offered pathways to relieve guilt through confession and indulgence, even if these practices were laden with hypocrisy. This easy forgiveness allowed individuals to navigate their moral failings without being burdened by the same intense psychological anguish that Protestantism encouraged. Figures like Casanova, who famously engaged in hedonistic behavior, observed that the Catholic Church's structure allowed him to find forgiveness and redemption without significant emotional or moral consequence. However, Nietzsche's critique wasn't solely aimed at religious systems. It extended to the ascetic ideal itself, which he saw as pervasive in both religion and secular life. As science began to replace religion as the dominant framework for understanding the world, the ascetic ideal didn't vanish, it transformed. In this new context, it didn't appear as a religious doctrine, but as a form of rationalism or intellectualism that still denied life's vitality. The ascetic ideal, Nietzsche argued, continued to shape thought through its focus on rationality, objectivity, and the denial of the body and its instincts. He believed that even scientific rationalism could perpetuate the same nihilistic underpinnings that religion once did. This is where Nietzsche's famous statement about the criminality of being Christian increasing with proximity to science comes into play. It's not simply a critique of religion versus science. Rather, it's about how individuals carry over the psychological effects of the ascetic ideal into their scientific worldview. If one moves away from religious belief but continues to hold on to the nihilistic framework that stems from the ascetic ideal, whether religious or secular, then, according to Nietzsche, they remain morally and psychologically culpable. The problem, in his eyes, is not just belief in Christianity, but the underlying philosophical and psychological assumptions that support it. The rejection of religious dogma alone is insufficient if one doesn't also confront and discard the deep-seated nihilism and life denial inherent in the ascetic ideal. In essence, Nietzsche's critique of Protestantism and his analysis of the ascetic ideal transcend a simple religious debate. They serve as part of a larger argument about the psychological and moral cost of life-denying values, whether expressed through religion, secular rationalism, or intellectualism. Nietzsche's insistence that a person can still embody the ascetic ideal even within the scientific worldview highlights his belief that both religion and modern rationality can serve the same repressive, life-denying function. The challenge then is not merely to abandon one system of belief for another, but to overcome the underlying nihilism that permeates both. Nietzsche's exploration of nihilism in science, particularly as it relates to the works of figures like Copernicus and Darwin, reflects his broader critique of life-denying values, both in religion and modern intellectual thought. In The Genealogy of Morals, he discusses how the scientific discoveries of these figures, which diminished humanity's perceived importance in the universe, contributed to a sense of nihilism. Copernicus's heliocentric theory, which displaced Earth from the center of the cosmos, and Darwin's theory of evolution, which placed humans as one species among many, had a profound psychological and existential impact. These discoveries, in Nietzsche's view, initiated a metaphorical fall of humanity, pushing it further away from the myth of its central importance in the universe. This loss of human dignity, in Nietzsche's eyes, is a symptom of the broader influence of the aesthetic ideal, the life-denying drive to elevate the spiritual over the physical and the mind over the body. Nietzsche's critique targets not just religion, but also science when it adopts a nihilistic outlook that further reduces humanity's role in existence. Rather than embracing the scientific view of the world as an opportunity to celebrate life, he critiques science for cultivating contempt for humanity and fostering a stoicism that resigns people to their insignificance. The key criticism here is that scientific knowledge, when framed in a nihilistic perspective, merely reinforces the same destructive tendencies that Nietzsche sees in Christianity. Rather than offering an escape from the aesthetic ideal, it perpetuates the same themes of life denial, reducing humanity to a mere cog in a vast, indifferent universe. Nietzsche's sharp condemnation of this form of science likens it to a modern equivalent of religious church services that foster the same life-denying mentalities. In his view, the celebration of humanity's insignificance by science only continues the cycle of nihilism and self-denial. The phrase, "the criminal of criminals is consequently the philosopher," requires deeper unpacking. On one level, it may appear contradictory, as Nietzsche has strongly criticized Christianity as the source of criminality. However, Nietzsche's use of criminal here is not a moral judgment, but rather a metaphorical and subversive one. In biblical language, the Hebrew superlative expresses the ultimate degree of equality, such as King of Kings or Vanity of Vanities. Nietzsche plays with this form, suggesting that the philosopher is the greatest criminal in that they transcend the life-denying systems of both religion and science. The philosopher, by opposing the established norms and breaking away from conventional thinking, is positioned as a rebel, one who challenges the status quo, not by conforming to any predefined moral code, but by dismantling the very foundations of society's intellectual and spiritual frameworks. Etymologically, the German word Verbrecher, criminal, is derived from brechen, to break, which captures Nietzsche's view of the philosopher as someone who breaks from conventional thought. Just as Copernicus and Darwin shattered outdated worldviews, the philosopher, in Nietzsche's terms, shatters the dominant paradigms of both religious and scientific thinking. Nietzsche himself embraces this role, describing his philosophy as a form of dynamite, intended to explode the entrenched ideas that have stifled human potential. In this sense, the philosopher is a criminal, not because of any traditional wrongdoing, but because they are willing to defy intellectual and societal norms in the pursuit of a life-affirming, creative vision. This subversive role of the philosopher aligns with Nietzsche's broader project of critiquing nihilism and advocating for the transcendence of the aesthetic ideal. The philosopher, in breaking away from these life-denying ideologies, becomes a disruptor of norms, challenging the frameworks that reduce humanity's potential. Through this lens, Nietzsche's critique of science and religion is not just a rejection of their conclusions, but a call for a more radical, life-affirming intellectual and spiritual revolution. Nietzsche's third proposition delivers a scathing critique of Christianity's origins, expressed through vivid, almost grotesque imagery. By describing the birthplace of Christianity as a site where it brooded over its basis eggs, he evokes an image of something dark and poisonous, a place that should be destroyed and turned into a horror-filled monument for posterity. This hyperbolic statement underscores Nietzsche's deep loathing of Christianity, a sentiment he often conveyed through exaggerated language and dramatic flourishes. He even goes as far as imagining poisonous snakes being bred atop this site, intensifying the sense of moral corruption and decadence he associates with Christianity. This extreme language likely pushed the boundaries of acceptable discourse for Nietzsche's contemporaries, prompting some to question his sanity, yet it illustrates his vehement rejection of the religion's foundational ideas. In his fourth proposition, Nietzsche targets the concept of chastity, particularly as preached by religious figures. He criticizes the promotion of chastity as a virtue, accusing it of generating a contempt for sexuality and turning it into something unclean. For Nietzsche, this represents a deep offense against the holy spirit of life, as he views chastity not just as a moral stance, but as a denial of the vitality and natural forces that drive human existence. This critique aligns with his broader philosophy of life affirmation, which calls for a celebration of natural instincts and a rejection of asceticism. Chastity, to Nietzsche, exemplifies the aesthetic ideal that he critiques in all its forms, whether in Christianity or in Schopenhauer's philosophy. Schopenhauer's influence on Nietzsche here is notable. Schopenhauer argued that voluntary chastity is the first step in asceticism, the denial of the will to life. For Schopenhauer, life is suffering, and the act of creating new life, given the inherent suffering of existence, is a moral wrong. Nietzsche, however, categorically rejects this worldview, considering it yet another form of life denial and nihilism. Where Schopenhauer saw chastity as a rational ethical precept shared across various religious traditions, Nietzsche saw it as a symptom of shared decadence. He viewed this shared emphasis on chastity as evidence of the broader sickness that the aesthetic ideal represents, a rejection of the physical, life-affirming world in favor of abstract spiritual concepts that devalue existence. Nietzsche's rejection of chastity also serves as an inversion of Christian values. Whereas Christianity elevates chastity and sexual purity as virtues, Nietzsche sees them as acts of self-harm, as they go against the natural creative force of life. He contends that it is chastity, rather than sexuality, that is truly sinful, as it seeks to deny life and its natural energies. For Nietzsche, sexuality is an expression of vitality and a powerful affirmation of life, whereas chastity is an artificial constraint that represses human instincts. However, Nietzsche is not advocating for unbridled hedonism or promiscuity. Rather, he acknowledges that Christianity's historical role in sublimating sexual drives into higher forms, such as romantic love, has had a significant cultural impact. This synthesis of Platonic love and pagan sensuality, according to Nietzsche, led to the birth of the concept of romantic love, a complex and profound form of emotional and physical connection that transcends mere physical pleasure. He sees this as a positive cultural development, albeit one that was born from the repression of sexual instincts. Nietzsche applies a psychological principle to this idea, suggesting that repression can actually increase desire, making the experience of that desire more intense and refined. Just as fasting heightens the enjoyment of food when it is finally eaten, the abstinence from sexuality can intensify one's appreciation of it when the restraint is lifted. This principle, which Nietzsche elaborates upon, parallels the way that great epochs of cultural and artistic achievement often emerge after periods of repression and restraint. In Nietzsche's view, the most powerful cultural and creative forces arise from the accumulation of energy and tension, which is later released in bursts of greatness. This concept foreshadows Freudian ideas about sublimation and repression, where suppressed desires are redirected into productive and creative channels. Thus, Nietzsche's critique of chastity and his broader views on sexuality challenge traditional Christian teachings while recognizing the complexity of human drives. His perspective is not a rejection of all moral frameworks, but an invitation to reconsider them, pushing for a philosophy that embraces life, vitality, and creative expression, even if it means upending centuries of accepted norms. Nietzsche acknowledges that Christianity, in its insistence on chastity, indirectly paved the way for the development of romantic love. Chastity acted as a kind of metaphorical dam, redirecting sexual energy inward and causing it to sublimate into psychological and romantic expressions. This internalization of sexuality, Nietzsche argues, is one of the rare contributions Christianity made to Western culture. However, Nietzsche does not view romantic love as a purely virtuous or altruistic force. In fact, he critiques the idealization of romantic love as an unselfish act, considering it one of the great blunders of psychology. For Nietzsche, the notion that romantic love is purely selfless and transcendent is misleading, as it often masks the deeper psychological and cultural dynamics that underlie it. He hints at exploring this idea more fully in his future works, indicating that the concept of romantic love is far more complex and potentially dangerous than its popular conception suggests. In his fifth proposition, Nietzsche intensifies his critique of religious institutions, particularly the priesthood. He argues that priests should be excommunicated from honest society, emphasizing the depth of his disdain for their role in maintaining traditional moral and religious frameworks. Nietzsche uses the term Khandala, derived from the lowest caste in the ancient Indian social hierarchy, to describe the priest. This metaphor emphasizes how priests, in Nietzsche's view, occupy the lowest and most contemptible position in society. The word Khandala suggests that priests, much like the untouchables, are marked as outsiders, worthy of ostracization. Nietzsche extends this metaphor to great men like philosophers, scientists, and artists, who often lead isolated hermit-like lives as a conscious choice. These individuals, Nietzsche contends, embody strength through their self-imposed separation from the herd. But priests are the antithesis of this strength. They embody a weakness that Nietzsche believes contaminates society, a weakness that should be driven out through radical separation. The sixth proposition marks a bold and radical turn in Nietzsche's critique of Christianity. He proposes that what has traditionally been called holy history should be renamed the accursed history. Terms like God, Savior, Redeemer, and Saint, which Christianity elevates to the highest status, should instead be used as insults associated with criminals. Nietzsche's reasoning for this inversion is rooted in his belief that Christianity represents the ultimate inversion of master morality, a moral system born from resentment and weakness. Christianity, in Nietzsche's view, is a slave morality that celebrates meekness, humility, and suffering as virtues, in contrast to the life-affirming, power-centered values of master morality. By rebranding these religious terms as insults, Nietzsche seeks to further invert the value system that Christianity has imposed upon Western culture. This radical revaluation of values is central to Nietzsche's philosophy and was intended to form the foundation of his larger, unfinished project, the transvaluation of values. Through this process of inverting and overturning traditional moral values, Nietzsche aims to free humanity from the life-denying constraints of religious dogma and affirm a more empowering, life-affirming set of principles. Nietzsche critiques the philosophical tradition of elevating abstract concepts to the top of a hierarchy, a position exemplified by Plato's theory of forms. In Plato's schema, the concept of the good is the supreme abstraction from which other ideas, such as beauty, justice, and truth, emanate. These ideas, according to Plato, gradually trickle down into the material world. Nietzsche, however, challenges this top-down thinking, arguing that it is backward. He suggests that the material world, the tangible, concrete reality of chairs and objects, should be considered the highest and most fundamental reality, as it is all we truly have access to. For Nietzsche, the highest concepts like the good are abstractions so far removed from the material world that they cannot be taken seriously as ultimate truths. He questions whether philosophers create these abstractions to escape the harshness or limitations of the material world, using lofty ideas as a refuge from reality. This critique extends to Christianity as well, which mirrors the Platonic elevation of abstract concepts. In Christianity, ideas such as justice, beauty, and truth are said to emanate from God, who is positioned at the apex of a moral and spiritual hierarchy. Nietzsche dismisses this top-down model as a philosophical prejudice, observing that many philosophers, like Descartes, tend to value abstractions that are causa sui, meaning things that exist by their own cause. Nietzsche argues that the search for a first cause, or an ultimate abstraction, culminates in the postulation of God, the most attenuated and empty of all ideas. For Nietzsche, this is a fundamental flaw in philosophical thinking, as it perpetuates a disregard for the material world and affirms concepts that are divorced from lived reality. In line with his critique of abstract thinking, Nietzsche's sixth proposition suggests that traditional Christian terms, like God, saint, and redemption, should be ridiculed rather than revered. This inversion of value is central to his philosophy of transvaluation, which seeks to overturn established moral and religious values. By ridiculing these revered terms, Nietzsche undermines the hierarchical structure of thought that places abstract ideas above the real, material world. This act of inversion is a radical rethinking of traditional values, a theme that runs through much of Nietzsche's work. Finally, Nietzsche's seventh proposition asserts that the logical consequences of these radical ideas follow naturally. While this proposition is not expanded upon in detail, it implies that Nietzsche's re-evaluation of values and critique of traditional religious and philosophical structures will lead to a broader transformation in how society understands itself. This rethinking will have profound implications for ethics, culture, and the organization of society, challenging the deeply ingrained beliefs that have shaped Western thought for centuries. In this way, Nietzsche's philosophy aims not just to critique individual concepts but to catalyze a wholesale reordering of human values and existence. The seventh proposition serves as an extension of Nietzsche's broader philosophy, encapsulating the ideas he's developed throughout his work and reinforcing the core message that the rest follows from this point. While it marks the conclusion of the Antichrist, it subtly hints at something deeper, signaling that there's more to come. Nietzsche likely included this final proposition as a form of mockery toward the sanctity of the number 7 in Christianity, but it also serves as a forward-looking statement. In fact, the subtitle of Beyond Good and Evil, a prelude to a philosophy of the future, suggests that Nietzsche's true focus lies in what's to come, not in a mere critique of the past. Nietzsche's critiques in the Antichrist are not limited to Christianity itself, but extend to its history. He explores how Jesus' original message was distorted by his disciples, how Christianity emerged as a form of slave morality in opposition to Roman power, and how St. Paul redirected the teachings of Jesus to fit his own agenda. Works like The Genealogy of Morals and Twilight of the Idols also scrutinize the past, but to view Nietzsche purely as a historian would miss the heart of his project. His real concern lies in the future, the looming challenge of nihilism, the rise of the aesthetic ideal, the implications of the death of God, the rapid advancements in science, and what all of this means for humanity and its place in the universe. Though Nietzsche is relatively silent on what his future philosophy will look like, his ideas point toward future leaders, free spirits who will help forge a new path after Nietzsche himself has dismantled old systems of belief. His writings contain glimpses of the Übermensch, a concept that represents the pinnacle of human development, someone who transcends conventional morality and embraces life affirmation. In this sense, Nietzsche's work has an air of prophecy, similar to the ancient oracles or the prophets of the Old Testament. Like them, Nietzsche speaks in riddles, hinting at a future world that remains largely veiled, but one that will be shaped by individuals capable of redefining values and creating a new destiny for humanity. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.